Jan and I formed the St Ninian's music group. About 10 young people turned up, including 3 9-year-olds with brass instruments, which they couldn't really play. So I gave them each 1 note per bar, making up the 3 notes of the relevant chord, and surprisingly, it worked quite well. We played once a month at the family service, using the new Mission Praise songbooks. The Bishop of the Isle of Man, Arthur Atwell, invited me to join those training to become readers and non-stipendiary ministers in their meetings with him. This led to Bill Martin and Sue Watterson being ordained deacons at Peel Cathedral. Jim and Judy Noakes and Graham and Muriel Gregory started to come round to Cedar Gates every Friday morning for a prayer breakfast. Jan and I went with Bill Martin, the Noakeses and the Gregorys to Acts 86 at the Birmingham NEC. This was a week-long international gathering of 7,000 Christians hosted by Michael Green, with John Wimber and his Vineyard team who were there leading the worship. Sometimes it seemed like an American game show, as people with one leg shorter than the other walked up with a gait to the stage, and then perfectly normally as they returned to their seats. But overall it was an uplifting event. After a number of interviews and weekends away, I began the process that might lead me into full-time Christian ministry. However, this wasn't the first time that I'd thought about it. My father and grandfather were priests, and inevitably I had considered the vocation for myself, but had not pursued it, because I knew that there was something missing. I could happily have taken on the social work side of the job, but I knew that I could not have administered the sacraments with integrity. I now began to become aware of the fact that I had been near to God on many occasions throughout my life, and that He had been with me the whole time. My baptism by my grandfather and my upbringing in a Christian home took on a new significance. I recalled the immense sense of oneness with God while serving at the altar during a midnight communion, or being close to Him on the Isle of Arran as Jan and I talked about Jesus. I recognised the influence of my grandfather, who had met Tubby Clayton of Toc H at a time when he was extremely angry and fed up with the carnage and futility of the First World War on the Somme. Tubby Clayton said to him, "Nothing is so sour that it cannot be sweetened." From that encounter, my grandfather eventually went out to Australia, where he trained for the ministry. My father was born out there, and when he went back there in 1989, he discovered people who fondly remembered my granddad from 55 years earlier. I went to the Ackham Selection Conference, where there were 8 candidates. We were observed discussing the subject, the Church in the 21st century, given a problem concerning the replacement of a curate in the parish, and a letter to write to a Sunday school superintendent who had resigned. We were also individually interviewed by the selectors: Raymond Ross, David Barker, Harry Curry, and Bill Norman. At the final Holy Communion service, I thought that I might be the only one with tears streaming down my face, until I saw the red eyes of others as we drank coffee afterwards. Before returning to the Isle of Man, I attended an ecumenical conference at Nottingham University called Strangers but Pilgrims. Two things stayed with me. One was a discussion about the meaning of mission. A black Pentecostal lady from central London said that for her it involved approaching strangers in the street and asking if they knew Jesus as their Lord and Saviour, because I might never see them again, she said. Whereas Philip Goodridge, the Bishop of rural Worcester, spoke of being with people for years until they ask the question, "Why do I do what I do? Then I name him," said the bishop. A week or two later, Bishop Arthur and Muriel Atwell came to tell me that I had been selected and that I should now look for a suitable training college. While all of this was going on, Tom Agnew, the head of business studies at the college, suffered a heart attack. He survived but was unable to return to work. The college principal, Brian Hallworth, asked me to run the department as acting head of department until interviews could be arranged for the next academic year. I began to study for an A-level in religious studies with the help from Simon Stevens, a teacher at St Ninian's High School and a reader at St Ninian's Church. Eventually I passed with a grade C and felt a bit better prepared for theological training at St John's College, Bramcote in Nottingham. We were now finding our Daihatsu Domino too small for the family. A newspaper advert brought people almost queuing for it. I went over to Liverpool to collect a Toyota Corolla estate, which saved us £1,000 off the local price. However, the local Toyota agent was very unhelpful when I took it to his garage for its 600-mile free service. He was quite indignant that I hadn't bought it from him. Caroline was not able to visit us at the New Year, as planned, because the steam packet ferry was unable to sail due to stormy weather. Instead we took Paul, Catherine, Darren and Kirsty on a New Year's Eve mystery trip to Silverdale Glen. Paul went on a visit to the House of Keys with his school. Afterwards I received a telephone call from his headmaster, Mr. Radcliffe, to say that Paul's exercise book had fallen from the balcony into the lap of a lawyer. It lay open at a page covered with phallic symbols. Paul wrote several letters of apology as we tried to keep straight faces. Paul started a paper round. One morning the police came to the door to inform us that Paul had been knocked over on the road. He had a bump on the back of his head and was suffering from shock. We stayed with him at the hospital until 2 p.m. and then the doctor sent us all home. Later on Paul became sick and so we returned him to hospital, where he stayed overnight for observation in his own private room with a television. On April Fool's Day, Paul sellotaped up the phone so it continued to ring after the receiver was lifted. In response, Jan rang Paul, pretending to be the police officer, offering him a £10 reward for an umbrella that he had found. Paul started at St Ninian's High School, where he played the part of Buttons in the school production of Alice in Blunderland. While Jan, Paul and Catherine flew over to Liverpool with Manx Airlines, Inca and I took the car on the boat to meet them. We stayed in Bournemouth with Eric and Edna. From there we visited a tank museum, Lulworth Cove and the New Forest. Then to Rotherham, where we twice went to St Thomas Crook's evening service with Caroline. We joined Mum and Dad on a trip to Everton Village Fair to sell their book about Grandpa Whiteman, Patriot, Padre, Priest. Andrew and I sold 11 copies door to door in Farthingstone and Everton. At one house we had to leap over the gate when a particularly fierce dog appeared from the back garden. I was called out on a Samaritan flying squad and discovered that it was for a former college student who didn't seem to recognise me. He had attempted suicide, and so with bandaged wrists I drove him to hospital. After 3 hours they asked me to take him to the Ballymona Mental Hospital. As I left him there, I felt that I had somehow let him down. Jan learned that Tremode House was to be closed and a youth offenders wing added to the prison. Mr. and Mrs. Dancox, who ran Tremode House, came to the Lent course that we ran at 2nd Avenue. Jan objected to the piano smashing competition that Mr. Dancox was organising and instead found buyers for the instruments. When we left, Mr. and Mrs. Dancox bought Jan a model of some otters and took us out for a meal at an Italian restaurant. We put the house on the market first at 155,000 and then at 130,000. Prospective buyers, Mr. and Mrs. Knight, who owned the BMN garage, came to view while we all had the flu and agreed to the new asking price. We then went to Nottingham, where houses were going like hotcakes. After a number of disappointing viewings, we agreed to buy a house in Penryn Crescent for £59,000. It was owned by a man who Jan and I referred to as Frankie because he reminded us of Frankie Howard. As we were moving to a smaller house, we had to sell and give away quite a few possessions. It was quite amazing what we were able to sell through the newspaper and auction sales. Norman Sale, head of art at the Isle of Man College, produced this picture on my last day there. The congregation at St Ninian's Church presented us with this painting of Peel Castle. For 3 consecutive summers, the 4 of us joined a one-to-one holiday. organised by Terry Clutterham of Scripture Union. The first two were held at a boarding school in Doveridge, near Uttoxeter. However, it had a dangerous lift with a door opening to reveal only a 20-foot drop. We sealed it off and used the stairs. I innocently volunteered to be the person who finally locked up at the end of each day. So it was well after midnight before I got to bed, and then the team meeting took place at 6 a.m. We organised the daily Brainbusters game with Jan operating the scoreboard and me reading the questions. Whenever the staff won, Father Grump, alias Duncan, chased the children out of the room, and when the staff lost, the children administered shaving cream pies. Paul thoroughly enjoyed Professor Soakam's experiment on the cricket field with flour bags and water-filled balloons. There was still flour in Jan's hair the following day. Hunt the Team in Uttoxeter involved staff members in silly disguises spread out around the town, and then the children being let loose to find us. I was disguised as a workman sweeping up around the marketplace and muttering under my breath. Richard went into a shop as a tailor's dummy in the window. The policeman that some children nabbed turned out to be a real one. I led the worship in the large hall, with the children sitting on the wide staircase. We played a giant game of drafts, with the leaders as the draftsmen. The third holiday was held at St. Anne's, and I was given the job of fulfilling children's wishes. I arranged for the police to arrive at breakfast and arrest the guest who had expressed an interest in joining the police force. I then spent the day with her and our police escort, looking round control rooms, watching dog handlers at work, and eating in the police canteen. On a trip to Alton Towers, the coach stopped and wouldn't go uphill, so we all had to get out and walk after it. Because of recent health and safety legislation, the Hunt the Team was confined to the school grounds, so it was much more difficult to hide, but my appearance changed considerably when I shaved my beard off and pretended to be a groundsman.